There is a door inside you that you have spent your entire life trying to keep closed. Behind it, there are no monsters, no demons, no darkness waiting to consume you. Behind that door is something far more terrifying than any nightmare your mind could conjure. Behind that door is the truth of who you really are, written in the language of pain. Every human being alive carries this door within them. Some people paint over it, some build walls around it, others fill their lives with so much noise, so much distraction, so much constant movement that they never have to acknowledge its existence. But the door remains, always, waiting, patient as stone, because pain, unlike pleasure, does not demand your immediate attention through seduction. It demands your attention through persistence. Tonight, we are going to open that door together. This is not a story about suffering for the sake of suffering. This is not an invitation to martyrdom or masochism. This is something far more radical, far more dangerous to everything you have been taught about happiness, success, and the so-called good life. This is an exploration of the most forbidden truth in our modern world, that emotional pain is not your enemy. It is not a malfunction. It is not something broken inside you that needs to be fixed, medicated, or positive thought away. Emotional pain is a technology, an ancient, sophisticated system of intelligence that predates language, predates civilization, predates even the earliest stirrings of human consciousness as we know it. And we have forgotten how to read its code. Imagine for a moment that you are living in a house with the most advanced security system ever designed. This system can detect threats you cannot see. It can sense dangers your conscious mind is completely blind to. It can predict catastrophes before they unfold and alert you with precision to exactly what needs your attention. But there is one problem. You have lost the instruction manual. You no longer understand what the alarms mean. So every time the system tries to protect you, you experience it as chaos, as malfunction, as something wrong with the house itself. This is your relationship with emotional pain. For the last 100 years, entire industries have been built on a single premise, that pain is the enemy and pleasure is the goal. Pharmaceutical companies manufacture pills to numb it. Self-help gurus sell techniques to transcend it. Social media algorithms are designed to distract you from it. Even the field of psychology, in many of its popular forms, has become obsessed with fixing pain as quickly as possible, as if the human psyche were a machine that occasionally breaks down and simply needs the right repairs. But what if we have it backwards? What if the pain is not the problem, but the solution trying to emerge? What if suffering is not a sign that something is wrong with you, but a sign that something is trying to become right? What if the very thing we spend our entire lives running from is actually the thing that can set us free? The ancient Greeks had a concept called pathemathos, learning through suffering. Not suffering for its own sake, but suffering as the crucible in which wisdom is forged. The alchemists of medieval Europe spoke of the nigredo, the blackening, the decomposition, the descent into darkness that was not the end of the work but the necessary beginning. Carl Jung, standing at the intersection of modern psychology and ancient wisdom, understood that what we call depression, anxiety, and existential crisis are often not pathologies but initiations, the psyche's way of forcing us to become who we truly are. In the Buddhist tradition, there is a teaching that has been misunderstood by almost everyone who encounters it. The first noble truth states that life is dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately meaning unsatisfactoriness, dis-ease, or the inability of things to permanently satisfy. Western interpreters often see this as pessimism, as if the Buddha was saying life is terrible and full of misery. But look deeper. The Buddha was not making a value judgment. He was making an observation about the architecture of reality itself. He was saying, the nature of existence includes pain, not as a flaw, as a feature. And if pain is a feature rather than a bug, then perhaps we need to learn how to read what it is telling us. Tonight, we are going to explore the forgotten power of emotional pain. We are going to trace its origins in the evolution of human consciousness. We are going to descend into the places where pain transforms into something else entirely. We are going to discover why the most awakened human beings throughout history, mystics, artists, revolutionaries, visionaries, were often the ones who had been broken by suffering and somehow emerged not weakened, but forged into something stronger than steel. This is season 2 of our journey, the awakening. And awakening, as you will discover, is not a peaceful process. It is not gentle. It does not arrive with soft music and morning light streaming through windows. Awakening is violent. It is the earthquake that shatters the foundations of everything you thought you knew. It is the death of the false self. It is the ego's collapse under the weight of truth it can no longer deny. And it begins with pain. So let me ask you directly, what are you in pain about right now? What is the thing you do not want to feel? What is the emotion you have been running from, numbing, denying, or trying to think your way out of? Is it grief? Is it shame? Is it loneliness? Is it the quiet terror that your life is not what you thought it would be? Is it the recognition that you have been lying to yourself about something fundamental? Whatever it is, I want you to know something. That pain is not random. It is not meaningless. It is not punishment from an uncaring universe. That pain is a message from the deepest part of yourself, written in the only language powerful enough to break through your defenses and get your attention. And if you can learn to listen to it, if you can learn to sit with it, to decode it, to understand what it is actually trying to tell you, it will lead you to the exact place where your transformation is waiting. But first, we must understand where this pain comes from. We must travel back to the origins of suffering itself, to the moment in human evolution when we became the only species on Earth capable of being wounded by our own thoughts. Because that is the secret no one tells you about emotional pain. It is the price we pay for consciousness itself. Are you ready to pay that price? Are you ready to discover what lies on the other side of the door you have spent your entire life keeping closed? Then let us begin. The journey into pain is the journey into yourself. And yourself, as you will soon discover, is far stranger and more magnificent than anything you have ever imagined. When consciousness became a wound. In the beginning, there was no suffering. Not because life was perfect, not because existence was without challenge or danger or death, but because suffering, as we know it, psychological suffering, emotional pain, the agony of self-consciousness, requires something very specific. It requires a self to suffer. Let me take you back. Back before cities, before agriculture, before written language. Back to a time when humans were barely distinguishable from other mammals in terms of our cognitive sophistication. About 2 million years ago, our ancestors were walking upright, using primitive tools, communicating in ways we can barely imagine. But they were not yet human in the way we understand that word today. They had no art, no religion, no sense of the future extending beyond the next season. And as far as we can tell from archaeological evidence, they had no sense of individual identity as we experience it. They existed in what some anthropologists call participation mystique, a state of consciousness where the boundary between self and world, between me and everything else, was fluid, permeable, perhaps barely existent at all. An animal does not suffer from existential dread. A chimpanzee does not lie awake at night questioning the meaning of its existence. A lion does not experience shame about its past or anxiety about its future. These creatures feel pain, certainly, physical pain, fear, perhaps even grief in rudimentary forms, but they do not suffer in the way humans suffer, because they do not have the one thing that makes human suffering possible. They do not have a constructed sense of self that can be threatened, wounded, or destroyed. Somewhere in the last 200,000 years of human evolution, something extraordinary happened, something unprecedented in the 4 billion-year history of life on this planet. The human brain developed the capacity for recursive self-reflection. We became aware of our own awareness. We developed the ability to observe ourselves from the outside, to imagine how others see us, to construct narratives about who we are and what our life means. We became conscious, and in that moment, we became capable of being wounded by our own thoughts. The neuroscience of this transformation is still being unraveled, but we know some crucial pieces. The development of the prefrontal cortex, the expansion of the neocortex, the evolution of language, these created the neurological substrate for something that had never existed before, a persistent sense of I that continues through time, that has a past to remember and a future to anticipate, that can be judged, evaluated, found wanting. And with this I came something else, the gap between what is and what should be, between who I am and who I think I should be, between the reality of my life and the imagined alternative that exists only in my mind. This gap is where all emotional pain is born. Listen carefully to this, because it is the key to everything that follows. Emotional pain is not caused by external circumstances. It is caused by the difference between external circumstances and the story you have told yourself about how things are supposed to be. A child who grows up in poverty does not suffer from poverty itself. They suffer from the recognition that others have more, from the internalized message that their condition means something about their worth, from the story they learn to tell themselves about what their lack signifies. A person who experiences rejection does not suffer from the rejection itself. They suffer from what they believe the rejection means about them, from the narrative they construct about being unlovable or unworthy. The pain is not in the event. The pain is in the interpretation, in the meaning you assign, in the story you tell yourself about what happened and what it means about who you are. This is why human suffering is so much more complex, so much more persistent, so much more devastating than the suffering of other creatures. We do not just experience pain in the moment. We carry it backward through memory and forward through anticipation. We replay it. We rehearse it. We build entire identities around it. We suffer the same event over and over again, long after the external circumstances have changed, because the internal narrative remains. The great myths of every culture encode this truth in symbolic form. In the Jewish and Christian tradition, the story of the Garden of Eden is not really about fruit and serpents. It is about the birth of self-consciousness. Adam and Eve, living in paradise, are not yet conscious of themselves as separate beings. They do not know they are naked. They do not experience shame. They exist in a state of unity with themselves and with their environment. Then comes the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And what happens the moment they eat it? They become self-conscious. They look at themselves. They judge themselves. They feel shame. They experience the gap between what they are and what they think they should be. They are expelled from paradise not by an angry God, but by the very structure of self-consciousness itself. Once you can see yourself from the outside, once you can judge and evaluate and find yourself wanting, you can never go back to the innocence of unself-conscious existence. Paradise is lost not because of sin, but because of awareness. The Greek myth of Prometheus carries the same essential truth in different form. Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. Fire, in the language of myth, represents consciousness, knowledge, the ability to see in the darkness. And what is Prometheus's punishment? He is chained to a rock where an eagle eats his liver every day for eternity, and every night his liver regenerates so the torture can begin again. This is the perfect symbol of human suffering. The capacity for awareness that allows us to transcend our animal nature is also the source of our ongoing torment. The same consciousness that makes us human is the consciousness that makes us suffer. And we cannot give it back. The gift cannot be returned. We are Prometheus, chained to the rock of self-awareness, experiencing the daily regeneration of pain that comes from being able to see ourselves clearly. But here is what is radical about these myths. They do not present consciousness as a curse. They present it as a necessary step in human evolution. The pain that comes with awareness is not a mistake. It is the price of becoming truly alive. Carl Jung spent his entire career exploring the psychological reality behind these mythological truths. In his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung describes his own descent into what he called confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological crisis following his break with Freud. For years, Jung experienced visions, heard voices, felt himself on the edge of madness. But he did not run from this experience. He did not try to medicate it away or positive think himself out of it. Instead, he descended into it. He engaged with it. He recorded his visions in what would later become the Red Book, a document so strange and powerful that Jung kept it hidden for decades. What Jung discovered during this period became the foundation of his entire psychological system, that what we call psychological symptoms, depression, anxiety, existential crisis, are not diseases to be cured, but messages from the unconscious, attempts by the deeper self to communicate with the conscious ego. The pain is not the problem. The pain is the psyche's way of saying, you are living in a way that is not aligned with your true nature. You are telling yourself a story about who you are that is false, and I am going to keep hurting you until you listen. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, and he was clear that it is not a peaceful process. It requires what he called the death of the ego, the collapse of the false identity you have constructed, the dissolution of the masks you wear, the destruction of every comfortable lie you have told yourself about your life. This death is painful. It is supposed to be painful, because pain is the chisel that cracks open the false shell of your persona to reveal the authentic self underneath. The existentialist philosophers understood this truth from a different angle. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote that we are condemned to be free, that human consciousness forces upon us an inescapable responsibility to create meaning in a universe that provides no inherent meaning. This freedom is experienced as anxiety, as angst, as a kind of metaphysical nausea. Because once you realize that there is no external authority telling you who to be or how to live, you are faced with the terrifying recognition that you must decide for yourself. And deciding for yourself, taking full responsibility for the construction of your own life, your own meaning, your own identity, is perhaps the most difficult thing a human being can do. It is so difficult that most people, according to Sartre, flee from it. They choose bad faith, living according to roles and identities that society provides, pretending they have no choice, hiding from the burden of their own freedom. But the pain will not let you hide forever. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the late 19th century, saw this crisis coming. He declared that God is dead, not as a celebration of atheism, but as a warning about what happens when a culture loses its central organizing myth. When the transcendent source of meaning and value collapses, when we can no longer believe in the stories our ancestors told themselves, we are faced with what Nietzsche called nihilism, the recognition that nothing inherently matters, that all values are human constructions, that we are afloat in a meaningless void. For Nietzsche, this recognition produces what he called the great nausea, a kind of existential sickness that is absolutely necessary. Because only after you have faced the void, only after you have experienced the collapse of all false meaning, can you begin the work of creating authentic meaning. Nietzsche's answer to nihilism was not to return to old beliefs, but to become what he called the Übermensch, the person who creates their own values, who says yes to life despite its suffering, who transforms pain into power through the act of conscious creation. But to get there, you must first be broken. Modern neuroscience is beginning to understand the biological mechanisms behind what these philosophers and psychologists described in more abstract terms. When you experience intense emotional pain, grief, heartbreak, existential crisis, specific regions of your brain light up. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes both physical and social pain, becomes hyperactive. The default mode network, responsible for self-referential thinking, goes into overdrive. Your brain is quite literally rewiring itself, breaking old neural patterns and creating the potential for new ones to form. This process is called neuroplasticity, and it is most active during periods of crisis and suffering. The comfortable, happy, secure version of you does not change much, because it does not need to. But the broken version of you, the version in pain, the version whose old patterns and beliefs have collapsed, that version of you is primed for transformation. Pain forces neuroplasticity. Pain forces growth. Pain forces you to become someone new, because the person you were can no longer function in the reality you are facing. Think about the most significant transformations in your own life. Think about the moments when you fundamentally changed, when you became a different person than you were before. I would wager that almost every one of those transformations was preceded by pain, by heartbreak, by failure, by loss, by some form of suffering that destroyed who you thought you were and forced you to rebuild from the foundation up. This is not a coincidence. This is not unfortunate. This is how transformation works. The caterpillar does not become a butterfly through comfort and security. It becomes a butterfly by dissolving into primordial soup inside the cocoon, breaking down at the cellular level, dying to its old form so completely that if you were to open the cocoon mid-transformation, you would find not a creature in transition, but a puddle of biological goo. The caterpillar must completely cease to exist for the butterfly to be born. This is the alchemical process that the medieval mystics understood and encoded in their symbolic language. The opus magnum, the great work, begins with nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the descent into death and decay. You must die before you can be reborn. You must dissolve before you can reconstitute at a higher level of complexity and consciousness. And the agent of this dissolution? Pain, suffering. The unbearable recognition that who you thought you were is not who you actually are. That the life you have been living is not the life you are meant to live. That every comfortable certainty you have clung to is an illusion, and that illusion is now crumbling. This is the origins of the power of emotional pain. It is not a malfunction. It is not punishment. It is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is the evolutionary mechanism by which consciousness transforms itself. It is the technology the universe has developed for creating beings capable of transcending their programming and becoming something new. But understanding this intellectually is not enough, because the real question is not, where does emotional pain come from? The real question is, what happens when you descend into it fully? What happens when you stop running and turn to face the very thing you have spent your entire life fleeing? To answer that question, we must go deeper. We must descend into the territories where pain becomes something else entirely, where suffering transforms into a strange kind of power, where the ego dies and something beyond the ego is born. We must enter the dark night of the soul. The conflict or descent, the dark night and the dissolution of self. There is a moment in every profound transformation where you lose everything, not just the external trappings of your life, though those may fall away too. What you lose is something far more fundamental. You lose your sense of who you are. You lose the narrative that has held your identity together. You lose your relationship to meaning itself. You enter what the Christian mystics called the dark night of the soul, a territory where all your maps fail, where every strategy for managing your pain collapses, where you are stripped down to something so raw and fundamental that you barely recognize yourself anymore. This is not depression, though it may look like depression from the outside. This is not breakdown, though it may feel like breakdown from the inside. This is initiation, and initiation, in the true sense of that word, is always a death before it becomes a rebirth. Let me tell you a story. In the winter of 1913, Carl Jung stood at the edge of a precipice, not a literal cliff, but something far more dangerous, the edge of his own sanity. His relationship with Sigmund Freud, the father figure who had shaped his intellectual development, had shattered. His professional reputation was in jeopardy. But more than any of this, something was happening inside him that he could neither understand nor control. He began experiencing visions. Powerful, overwhelming images would flood his consciousness without warning. He saw Europe drowning in blood. He saw civilization collapsing. He heard voices that did not belong to anyone he knew. At night, his dreams were so vivid, so archetypal, so strange that he could barely distinguish them from waking reality. Jung was terrified. He was a psychiatrist, a man of science, someone who had spent his career studying madness in others. And now he could feel himself sliding toward the same abyss. He had two choices. He could resist these experiences, classify them as symptoms, medicate them away, and try to return to normal life. Or he could do something no scientist of his era would consider. He could surrender to the descent. He could enter into active dialogue with his own disintegration. He chose the latter. Every day, Jung would sit and allow the visions to come. He would engage with them, question them, record them in meticulous detail. He treated his own unconscious as if it were a foreign territory that needed to be explored, mapped, understood. He descended into what he would later call the confrontation with the unconscious, a deliberate, conscious journey into the chaos of his own psyche. This process nearly destroyed him. There were days when he was not sure he would survive it. Days when the boundary between himself and the contents of his unconscious became so thin that he had to physically ground himself, touching the walls, reminding himself that he was Dr. Jung, that he had a family, that he existed in concrete reality. The pain of this dissolution was unlike anything he had experienced before. It was not the pain of a broken bone or a failed relationship. It was the pain of the ego structure itself, cracking under the pressure of forces it could not contain. But something remarkable happened. After years of this descent, Jung began to notice patterns. The chaos was not random. The visions had structure. The voices were not meaningless ravings, but expressions of different aspects of himself that had been repressed, denied, or never acknowledged. He began to recognize what he would later call archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that exist below the level of personal consciousness in what he termed the collective unconscious. And slowly, painfully, through this confrontation with his own depths, Jung was transformed. He emerged not as the man he had been before, but as someone fundamentally different. Someone who had died to his old identity and been reborn into a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. The pain had not destroyed him. It had initiated him into a level of psychological and spiritual reality that most people never access because they are too afraid to descend. This pattern, this journey from crisis through disintegration to renewal, is not unique to Jung. It appears throughout human history in the lives of every person who underwent genuine transformation. It appears in the lives of mystics, artists, visionaries, and ordinary people who were broken by circumstance and somehow became more whole in the breaking. St. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystic, gave this journey its most famous name, the dark night of the soul. But if you actually read his poetry and theological writings, you discover something surprising. The dark night is not a punishment. It is not abandonment by God. It is precisely the opposite. It is the mechanism by which superficial faith is transformed into direct experiential knowledge. It is the stripping away of all conceptual understanding, all comfortable certainties, all second-hand beliefs, until you are left naked in the presence of reality itself. St. John writes, "One dark night, fired with love's urgent longings, the sheer grace, I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. The house that must be stilled is the ego, the ordinary self with its strategies and defenses and comfortable illusions. That house must fall asleep, or more accurately, must be put to death. for the soul to escape and encounter the divine directly. This is what the dark night does. It destroys your second-hand relationship with truth and forces you into a primary encounter with reality. And this destruction is experienced as agony because you are invested in your conceptual understanding. You have built your entire sense of self on a scaffolding of beliefs, stories, and interpretations. When that scaffolding is removed, when those beliefs are revealed as inadequate, when those stories collapse, you feel like you are dying. Because you are. The false you is dying, and the false you is the only you that you have ever known. Contemporary psychology has begun to document this phenomenon in clinical terms, though often without understanding its deeper significance. When people experience what is called a psycho-spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency, they often display symptoms that look like mental illness, dissociation, hearing voices, experiencing visions, losing their grip on consensus reality. But research by psychologists like Stanislav Grof and Christina Grof has shown that if these experiences are supported and integrated rather than merely suppressed, they often lead to profound healing and transformation. The difference between a spiritual emergency and a mental breakdown is not necessarily in the symptoms themselves, but in the relationship the person has to those symptoms and the support they receive in navigating them. If you see your psychological disintegration as a meaningless malfunction, as something broken that needs to be fixed as quickly as possible, you will medicate it, suppress it, fight it. And in fighting it, you may actually prolong your suffering and miss the opportunity for transformation that the crisis contains. But if you can understand your disintegration as part of a larger process of psychological and spiritual maturation, if you can see it as the caterpillar dissolving in the cocoon rather than as a catastrophe, then you can work with it rather than against it. You can allow the death of the old self without clinging desperately to preserve it. You can trust that on the other side of this dissolution, something new can be born. This is the terrifying paradox at the heart of emotional pain. The only way out is through, not around, not over. Not by thinking your way out, or medicating your way out, or distracting your way out. Through. Directly through the center of the thing you most want to avoid. Consider the experience of grief, perhaps the most universal form of emotional pain. When someone you love dies, you are not just mourning the loss of that person. You are mourning the loss of your identity as someone who has that person in your life. You are mourning the loss of a future you imagined. You are mourning the loss of a version of yourself that could still believe in permanence, still believe that the people you love will always be there, still believe that you are safe from the ultimate truth of impermanence. Grief is the slow, brutal process of accepting that everything changes, that nothing lasts, that every attachment will eventually be severed. And this acceptance requires a fundamental reorganization of your psyche. The neural networks in your brain that were wired to include this person must be rewired. The narrative of your life must be rewritten. The sense of who you are must be reconstructed without this person as part of it. This is why grief comes in waves. Each wave is your psyche attempting to process and integrate the reality of loss. Each wave is another piece of your old identity dissolving so that a new identity, one that includes the reality of this absence, can form. The pain of grief is the pain of transformation, and the only way to complete the transformation is to feel the pain fully, to allow each wave to move through you, to resist the temptation to shut down or numb out, or pretend the loss did not happen. Our modern culture is pathologically bad at supporting people through this process. We give people 3 days of bereavement leave and expect them to return to full productivity. We offer platitudes like, "They're in a better place," or "everything happens for a reason." Empty phrases that short-circuit genuine grief and force people to suppress their pain for the comfort of others. We prescribe antidepressants if the sadness lasts too long, as if there is a normal timetable for the dissolution of identity. but the ancient cultures understood. They created elaborate mourning rituals that could last for months or even years. They recognized that grief is not something you get over, but something you must go through so completely that you emerge as a different person on the other side. The Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva, the Irish wake, the Mexican Dia de los Muertos. These rituals did not try to minimize pain or rush people past it. They created containers for pain, spaces where it was permitted, expected, honored as a necessary part of being human. And what these traditions understood implicitly is what neuroscience is now confirming explicitly. When you allow emotional pain to move through you fully, when you do not resist it or suppress it or medicate it away prematurely, your brain completes the processing of that emotion. The neural networks associated with the painful memory or experience become integrated rather than fragmented. The trauma is metabolized, the grief is digested, and you are changed by it, but not destroyed by it. But when you resist the pain, when you cut short the natural grieving process, when you force yourself to move on before the psychological work is complete, the pain does not disappear. It goes underground. It becomes what Jung called the shadow, the part of your psyche that contains everything you cannot accept about yourself, everything you have repressed or denied or pushed out of consciousness. And the shadow always returns. Sometimes it returns as physical symptoms, chronic pain, autoimmune diseases, unexplained illnesses that baffle doctors because they have no clear physiological cause. The body, as Bessel van der Kolk's research has shown, literally keeps the score of unprocessed trauma and emotional pain. Sometimes it returns as addictive behaviors, substance abuse, compulsive work, relationship addiction, any pattern where you use something external to numb or avoid what is internal. The addiction is not the problem. The addiction is the solution to a problem you do not want to face directly. And it will persist until you turn and face the thing the addiction is protecting you from. Sometimes it returns as rage, as sudden explosions of anger that seem disproportionate to the trigger, as a chronic bitterness or cynicism that colors everything you see. Unexpressed grief often becomes anger. Unacknowledged shame becomes rage. The emotional energy that was denied its natural expression finds distorted forms of release. And sometimes, perhaps most commonly, it returns as a kind of deadness, a numbness, a feeling that you are going through the motions of life but not actually living. Because when you shut down your capacity to feel pain, you also shut down your capacity to feel joy, love, beauty, connection. You cannot selectively numb. If you close yourself off to the difficult emotions, you close yourself off to everything. You become, in T.S. Eliot's phrase, one of the hollow men, existing but not fully alive. This is the danger of our culture's war on pain. In trying to eliminate suffering, we risk eliminating the very capacity for depth that makes us human. We create a society of people who are comfortable but not alive, secure but not growing, protected but not truly living. But here is the revelation that emerges from the descent. Pain is not the opposite of life. Numbness is the opposite of life. Pain is evidence that you are still alive, still capable of responding, still engaged with reality rather than hiding from it. And when you can learn to stay present with pain, when you can learn to feel it without being destroyed by it, when you can learn to listen to what it is telling you rather than simply trying to make it stop, that is when pain transforms into something else. It transforms into power. Not power in the sense of domination or control, power in the sense of agency, authenticity, the capacity to act from your deepest truth rather than from fear or social conditioning. The person who has genuinely confronted their pain, who has died to their false self and been reborn into their authentic self, becomes remarkably powerful, not because they are invulnerable, but because they are no longer afraid of being vulnerable, not because they cannot be hurt, but because they know they can survive being hurt and come out transformed. This is what Nietzsche meant by his most famous and most misunderstood phrase, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." He was not glorifying suffering for its own sake. He was recognizing that the person who has been broken and has reassembled themselves is stronger than the person who has never been tested. The bone that breaks and heals is stronger at the point of the break. The psyche that shatters and integrates is more resilient than the psyche that has never been challenged. But, and this is crucial, this transformation only happens if you engage with the pain consciously, if you descend into it willingly rather than being dragged into it kicking and screaming, if you treat it as an initiatory experience rather than as a catastrophe to be avoided at all costs. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, understood this truth from the most extreme circumstances imaginable. In the concentration camps, Frankl observed that the prisoners who survived were not necessarily the physically strongest or the most privileged. Often, they were the ones who could find meaning in their suffering, who could maintain some sense of purpose even in the midst of unspeakable horror. Frankl wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." This is the essence of what he called logotherapy, the recognition that humans can bear almost any suffering if they can find meaning in it. The pain itself does not destroy us. What destroys us is meaningless suffering, suffering that seems pointless and endless and devoid of any purpose. But here is the radical insight. Meaning is not something you find in suffering. Meaning is something you create through suffering. You do not discover a pre-existing purpose in your pain. You forge purpose by choosing how you respond to it, by deciding what you will become because of it, by transforming the raw material of your suffering into something valuable: wisdom, compassion, strength, art. This is the alchemy. This is the secret. Pain is the prima materia, the raw material that can be transformed into gold, but the transformation requires your participation. It requires consciousness. It requires that you engage with the pain as an active agent rather than a passive victim. And this brings us to the most difficult question of all. How do you actually do this? How do you engage with unbearable pain without being destroyed by it? How do you descend into the dark night without being consumed by darkness? The answer is simultaneously simple and impossibly difficult. You learn to witness your pain without identifying with it. You learn to observe your thoughts and emotions without believing that they are who you are. You learn to create space between the awareness that is observing and the experience that is being observed. You learn to say, "I am feeling this," rather than "I am this." "I am experiencing anxiety," rather than "I am an anxious person." "I am having thoughts of worthlessness," rather than "I am worthless." This is the core practice of every contemplative tradition: Buddhist mindfulness, Hindu self-inquiry, Christian contemplative prayer, secular meditation. They all point to the same fundamental shift in perspective. You are not your thoughts. You are not your emotions. You are not even your sense of self. You are the awareness in which all of these phenomena arise. And when you can stabilize in that awareness, even briefly, something extraordinary happens. You can feel intense emotional pain without being destroyed by it. You can watch your ego structure dissolving without clinging desperately to preserve it. You can be present with your suffering without either suppressing it or being overwhelmed by it. This is not dissociation. This is not detachment or numbness. This is a profound form of presence. You are fully feeling the pain, but you are no longer fused with it. You are like the sky watching clouds pass. The clouds may be dark and stormy, but the sky is not damaged by them. The sky remains vast and clear and fundamentally unchanged, even as it contains the storm. When you can access this perspective, pain stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you are witnessing. And in that witnessing, there is a strange kind of freedom. The pain continues, but your relationship to it transforms. You stop fighting it. You stop demanding that it be different than it is. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is this teaching me? What is trying to emerge through this experience? What am I becoming in this crucible?" These questions shift everything. They transform you from victim to participant. They turn suffering from something meaningless into something that can be metabolized into wisdom. But I must be honest with you, this is not easy. It is perhaps the hardest thing a human being can do, because your entire survival instinct is telling you to flee from pain, to fight it, to do anything except simply be with it. Every cell in your body is screaming at you to run, and yet the teaching is stay, feel, witness, allow. This is why every genuine spiritual tradition includes periods of intensive practice, meditation retreats, vision quests, monastic seclusion, contemplative solitude. These are not escapes from the world. They are intensive training grounds for developing the capacity to be present with discomfort, to sit with pain, to witness the dissolution of your familiar sense of self without panicking. And what you discover in these spaces, if you go deep enough, is that on the other side of the pain, there is something that was there all along, but that you could not see because you were too busy running. On the other side of the ego's dissolution, there is a deeper identity that was never threatened in the first place. On the other side of the dark night, there is a different kind of light. But to reach it, you must complete the descent. You must go all the way down. You must allow the death to be total, so that the resurrection can be real. Are you willing to die? Not physically, but psychologically? Are you willing to let everything you think you are be stripped away so that what you actually are can be revealed? This is the question the dark night asks, and your answer to that question will determine everything that comes next. The awakening or revelation, the phoenix and the power beyond pain. There is a moment after the descent when something shifts. It is not dramatic. It is not a sudden explosion of enlightenment or a voice from the heavens declaring your transformation complete. It is quieter than that, subtler. You wake up one morning and realize that the pain is still there, but it no longer defines you. The grief still moves through you, but it no longer consumes you. The fear still arises, but it no longer controls you. You have not conquered the pain. You have become larger than it. You have expanded to a size where the pain is just one part of your experience, not the whole of it. Like learning to hold a burning coal in your bare hand, not by making your hand impervious to fire, but by understanding that you are not just the hand. You are also the arm, the body, the breath, the awareness that witnesses the sensation of burning without identifying with it completely. This is the awakening, and it changes everything. Carl Jung emerged from his confrontation with the unconscious as a fundamentally different man than the one who entered it. He did not return to being the rational scientist, the respectable psychiatrist, the disciple of Freud. That version of himself had been sacrificed. In its place was someone who had touched the collective depths of human experience and brought back maps of the territory. His concepts, the collective unconscious, archetypes, the shadow, individuation, synchronicity, these were not abstract theories. They were lived experiences, hard-won insights forged in the crucible of his own psychological death and rebirth. And the work Jung did in the decades that followed shaped modern psychology, depth psychotherapy, and our very understanding of what it means to be human. But none of that would have been possible without the descent, without the willingness to be broken, without the courage to stay present with the dissolution of his own ego and identity. This pattern repeats throughout history. Every genuine contribution to human consciousness comes from someone who descended into their own depths and returned transformed. Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet who wrote some of the most profound spiritual poetry in human history, spent decades as a respectable religious scholar before he met Shams of Tabriz, a wandering mystic who destroyed Rumi's comfortable religious certainties and initiated him into direct spiritual experience. When Shams disappeared, likely murdered by Rumi's jealous students, Rumi descended into profound grief. For years he grieved so completely that his entire identity as a scholar dissolved, and from that dissolution emerged the poetry, the whirling, the ecstatic worship of the divine that transcended all religious boundaries. Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." He was not speaking metaphorically. He had lived this truth. The wound of Shams's loss had cracked open his heart so completely that something infinite could pour through. His pain became the birth canal for his art, his wisdom, his transformation into one of humanity's greatest spiritual teachers. Or consider the Buddha, Prince Siddhartha, born into luxury and privilege, protected from all suffering by his father's careful arrangements. But the story tells us that one day he ventured outside the palace and saw 4 sights: a sick man, an old man, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic. These encounters with suffering shattered his comfortable worldview. He realized that all the pleasure and security of his palace life was temporary, that suffering was inevitable, that death awaited everyone. This recognition, this confrontation with the first noble truth, threw him into crisis. He abandoned his palace, his family, his comfortable life. He spent years trying to overcome suffering through extreme asceticism, through denial of the body, through punishing spiritual practices. But none of it worked. He nearly died from starvation, but he did not find enlightenment. It was only when he stopped fighting, when he sat under the Bodhi tree and simply allowed himself to be present with reality as it was, including his pain, his doubt, his fear, that the awakening came. Not by conquering suffering, but by understanding its nature. Not by transcending pain, but by recognizing that the clinging to pleasure and the aversion to pain were themselves the cause of suffering. The Buddha's awakening was not an escape from the human condition. It was a profound acceptance of it, coupled with the recognition that within that acceptance lies a freedom more vast than any pleasure-based happiness could provide. This is the paradox that emerges again and again. The freedom you are seeking does not come from avoiding pain. It comes from changing your relationship to pain. When you stop seeing pain as the enemy, when you stop believing that your worth depends on how much pleasure you can accumulate and how much pain you can avoid, when you recognize that both pleasure and pain are temporary phenomena arising in the unchanging space of awareness, that recognition liberates you, not from pain itself, from the fear of pain, from the need for life to be other than it is, from the endless, exhausting struggle to control the uncontrollable. In the Christian mystical tradition, this recognition is called kenosis, the emptying. Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, facing his crucifixion, praying, "Not my will, but yours be done." The ultimate surrender, the complete relinquishing of the ego's demands about how things should be. And in that surrender, according to the tradition, lies the resurrection. You must die on the cross before you can rise on the 3rd day. The ego must be crucified before the divine self can be revealed. Secular philosophy arrived at similar insights through different routes. Albert Camus, writing in the aftermath of World War II, faced the question of meaning in an absurd universe. His answer was not optimism or positive thinking. It was something more radical. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. We must find meaning and even joy in the eternal repetition of pushing the boulder up the mountain, even knowing it will roll back down. Not by denying the absurdity, but by embracing it, by choosing to create meaning in the face of meaninglessness, by rebelling against the void through the affirmation of life itself, even, especially, when life is hard. This is not passive acceptance. This is active engagement. This is the recognition that you are the creator of meaning, and that the power to create meaning is never taken from you, even in the worst circumstances. Viktor Frankl in Auschwitz, Nelson Mandela in prison, Malala Yousafzai after being shot, Anne Frank hiding in the attic. These are not people who avoided suffering. These are people who transformed suffering into testimony, into resistance, into beauty, into profound human connection. And here is what neuroscience is now revealing about this transformation. When you engage with emotional pain consciously, when you process it rather than suppress it, your brain literally changes. The areas associated with fear and threat response become less reactive. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and emotional regulation, strengthens. The connections between different brain regions become more integrated. But more than this, something called post-traumatic growth occurs. This is not just resilience, returning to your previous baseline after trauma. This is transformation, becoming more than you were before. Studies show that people who have experienced significant adversity and processed it consciously often report greater appreciation for life, stronger relationships, increased personal strength, new possibilities, opening up spiritual or existential deepening. They do not say the trauma was good. They say that what they became through the trauma was valuable. The pain was the catalyst. The processing was the work. The growth was the result. This is the forgotten power of emotional pain. It is not just something to endure. It is not just something to survive. It is something that, when engaged with consciously, has the capacity to transform you at the deepest levels of your being. Think about your own life. Think about the version of yourself that existed before your most significant pain. That version was, in some fundamental way, innocent. Not innocent in a moral sense, but innocent in the sense of not knowing. That version of you had not yet been tested, had not yet discovered what you are made of, had not yet been forced to confront the depths of your own psyche. Now think about who you are after that pain, after you have walked through the fire and emerged on the other side. You are not the same person. You cannot be. The experience has inscribed itself into your nervous system, into your worldview, into the very structure of your identity. And yes, you have lost something. You have lost your innocence. You have lost the comfortable belief that you are safe, that life is fair, that bad things only happen to other people. You have lost the simple happiness that comes from not knowing. But look at what you have gained. You have gained depth. You have gained compassion, the capacity to understand others' suffering because you have touched your own. You have gained strength, not the brittle strength of never being challenged, but the supple strength of having been broken and healing. You have gained wisdom, the kind that cannot be learned from books or teachings, but only from direct experience of life's fundamental truths. You have gained authenticity, because the person who has never suffered can afford to wear masks, to perform, to present a carefully curated version of themselves to the world. But the person who has been stripped down to their essence by pain no longer has the energy for pretense. They have seen themselves at their worst. They have touched their shadow. They have confronted their mortality and their vulnerability and their profound inability to control the universe. And in that confrontation, something remarkable happens. They become real. The Velveteen Rabbit, in Marjorie Williams's children's story, asks the skin horse what it means to be real. And the skin horse answers, "Real isn't how you are made. It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." "Does it hurt?" asked the rabbit. "Sometimes," says the skin horse. "When you are real, you don't mind being hurt." This is the paradox. Becoming real, becoming authentic, becoming truly yourself, requires being hurt, requires the wearing away of everything that is false, everything that is protective coloring, everything that is performance. And this wearing away hurts. It is supposed to hurt. But once you are real, once you have been through the fire and emerged as your essential self, the hurt has a different quality. It still happens. Life still brings loss and disappointment and pain. But you are no longer afraid of it in the same way, because you know that pain cannot destroy what is real in you. It can only burn away what is false. This is the power that lies beyond pain, not in vulnerability but genuine strength, not the absence of suffering, but the capacity to be transformed by suffering rather than destroyed by it. Not numbness, but presence. Not escape, but engagement. Not denial, but integration. And when you can access this power, when you can move through the world with the knowledge that you have died and been reborn, something shifts in how you relate to everything. You become less afraid, less defended, less concerned with protecting an image or maintaining a persona. You become more willing to take risks, to be vulnerable, to love fully even knowing that loss is inevitable. You become more alive. This is what every spiritual tradition has been trying to tell us in its own symbolic language. The death of the ego is not the end. It is the beginning. The dissolution of your false self is not a catastrophe. It is an invitation. The dark night is not abandonment. It is initiation into a deeper level of reality. But, and this is crucial, this transformation is not guaranteed. Pain alone does not automatically lead to growth. Many people experience trauma and are simply traumatized. Many people face crisis and are simply broken. Many people encounter suffering and become bitter, closed, hardened rather than opened. The difference lies in consciousness, in whether you engage with the pain actively or passively, in whether you treat it as meaningless or as potentially meaningful, in whether you run from it or turn toward it, in whether you suppress it or integrate it. This is why practice matters. Why meditation, therapy, contemplation, art, ritual, community, all the ways humans have developed for processing difficult experience are so important. They provide structures for engaging with pain consciously. They create containers where transformation can occur safely. They offer tools for staying present with discomfort rather than dissociating from it, and they remind you that you are not alone in this. Every human being who has ever lived has faced pain. Every single one. The question is not whether you will suffer. The question is what you will do with your suffering. Will you let it embitter you, or will you let it deepen you? Will you let it close your heart, or will you let it crack your heart open? Will you let it convince you that life is meaningless, or will you use it as the raw material from which you forge meaning? The choice, impossible as it may seem when you are in the depths of pain, is yours. Because even when you cannot control what happens to you, you can always control how you respond to what happens. This is the last freedom, as Frankl called it, the freedom that cannot be taken from you even in the most extreme circumstances, the freedom to choose your attitude, your interpretation, your meaning-making. And when you exercise that freedom consciously, when you choose to engage with your pain as an opportunity for transformation rather than as a catastrophe to be avoided, you step into a different relationship with life itself. You stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances and start seeing yourself as a participant in your own becoming. You stop demanding that life be comfortable and start asking that life be real, meaningful, authentic. This shift from victim to participant, from passive to active, from avoiding pain to engaging with it, is the awakening. It is not a one-time event. It is a continuous practice, a moment-by-moment choice to stay present with what is, to allow the pain to move through you, to trust that you can survive the fire and be transformed by it. And as more people make this shift, as more humans learn to engage with their pain consciously, something begins to change in the collective consciousness of our species. We begin to evolve, not biologically, but psychologically and spiritually. We begin to develop the capacity to hold more complexity, more paradox, more consciousness. We begin to move beyond the simple pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain towards something more mature. The capacity to embrace life in its totality, light and shadow, joy and sorrow, birth and death. This is the future of human consciousness. Not a future without pain, but a future where we know how to work with pain, where we understand its message, where we can use it as a tool for transformation rather than being destroyed by it. This is the world that becomes possible when we remember the forgotten power of emotional pain. the message written in fire. So here we are, at the end of our journey together. But of course, it is not really the end. It is the beginning, because everything I have shared with you tonight was not meant to be merely understood intellectually. It was meant to be lived, embodied, practiced in the laboratory of your own experience. You came to this with a question, whether you knew it or not. The question was, what do I do with this pain I am feeling? How do I make it stop? How do I escape it? And what I hope you have discovered is that these are the wrong questions. Or more precisely, they are the questions of someone who has not yet understood what pain is for. The right questions are, what is this pain trying to tell me? What am I being asked to see that I have been refusing to see? What false version of myself is being stripped away so that my true self can emerge? What is dying in me so that something new can be born? These questions transform everything. They turn suffering from something that happens to you into something that happens through you. They turn pain from an enemy into a teacher. They turn crisis from catastrophe into opportunity. But I want to be very clear about something. This does not mean that pain is good. It does not mean you should seek suffering or glorify it or romanticize it. Pain is still painful. Grief still hurts. Loss is still loss. The invitation is not to pretend that these things do not matter or that you should somehow enjoy being in agony. The invitation is to change your relationship to pain, to stop seeing it as evidence that something is wrong with you and start seeing it as evidence that something is trying to become right, to stop running from it and start turning toward it with curiosity and courage, to stop demanding that life spare you from suffering and start asking what you can learn from the suffering that life inevitably brings. Because here is the final truth, the one that everything else has been building toward. You are not your pain. You are the consciousness that is aware of pain. You are the space in which pain arises and eventually passes. You are the sky, not the clouds. And when you can touch that awareness, even briefly, everything changes. The pain continues, but you are free from it in a way that has nothing to do with the pain ending. You are free because you have recognized that your deepest identity, the awareness, the presence, the consciousness that you truly are, cannot be damaged by any experience, no matter how painful. Experiences arise, experiences pass, but the awareness that witnesses them remains. This is not escapism. This is not spiritual bypassing. This is the most radical form of engagement possible, being so present with your pain that you discover you are larger than it, that you contain it rather than it containing you. And from that place of spacious awareness, you can respond to your pain with wisdom rather than reactivity. You can feel it fully without being overwhelmed by it. You can honor it without being defined by it. You can let it teach you without letting it destroy you. This is what the ancients knew. This is what the mystics practiced. This is what the depth psychologists mapped. This is what the neuroscience is confirming. This is the forgotten power of emotional pain. It is the evolutionary mechanism by which consciousness learns to hold more, to see more clearly, to become more than it was. And you? Yes, you, listening to this right now, you are part of that evolution. Your pain is not a personal failing. It is not evidence that you are broken or weak or less than. Your pain is your participation in the great work of consciousness becoming aware of itself. Your suffering is how the universe teaches itself about the nature of existence. Your transformation is how humanity evolves toward greater wisdom and compassion. This is not a burden. This is an honor, a terrible, beautiful honor. So what do you do now? What do you do with the pain you are feeling right now, today, in this moment? You feel it. You breathe into it. You stop trying to make it go away and start asking what it is trying to show you. You sit with it, even when every instinct is screaming at you to run. You trust that you are larger than it, even when it feels overwhelming. You remember that you have survived 100% of your worst days so far. You know that this too will transform if you can stay present with it long enough. And you remember that you are not alone. Every person who has ever lived has walked this path. The path through pain to power. The path through death to rebirth. The path through the dark night to the dawn that comes after. You are walking in the footsteps of everyone who has ever been broken and become whole again. You are part of an ancient lineage of wounded healers, of transformed transformers, of people who turned their suffering into service and their pain into purpose. Your pain is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where you are more real, more authentic, more alive than you have ever been before. A chapter where you know yourself not as the carefully constructed persona you present to the world, but as the raw, vulnerable, magnificent human being you actually are. So open the door, the one you have been keeping closed, the one behind which your pain lives. Open it and walk through, not because it will be easy, not because it will be comfortable, but because on the other side of that door is the person you are meant to become, the person who has touched the depths and returned with treasure, the person who knows that they can survive anything because they have already survived the thing they thought would destroy them. The message written in your pain is always the same message, though it takes 10,000 forms. You are more than you think you are. You are stronger than you believe. You are being asked to become who you truly are, and that becoming requires you to die to who you think you are. This is the awakening. This is the forgotten power of emotional pain. This is the gift hidden in the wound, and it has been waiting for you all along. Long silence. The echoes of the ancients whisper to us across time. Remember who you are. Remember what you are capable of. Remember that every human being who ever became truly wise, truly compassionate, truly alive, walked through the fire first. And the fire did not destroy them. It refined them. It forged them into something that could hold more light. You are that person. You are walking through your fire right now. And on the other side, not in some distant future, but in the very next moment of genuine presence, your true self is waiting. The door is open. The journey begins. The transformation is already underway. Welcome to your awakening.